Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Allen. Well, 2020 was quite the year. It started off as the year of the rat, according to the Chinese zodiac calendar, but quickly devolved into the year of COVID. Well, today we have a special show for you here at the News Forum. We're doing a year in review. We're going to be talking about all sorts of issues that made the headlines and many others that perhaps were sidelined because of COVID's overshadowing. Well, joining me now is Nathaniel Dueck, senior writer and analyst for the News Forum, joining me in studio for this discussion. Nathaniel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
So this was a crazy year.
Yeah, that's saying it.
And not even being overly dramatic and with full emphasis as I say that. Yeah. How did it start off?
Well, I mean, I think it's significant that the year started off with an actual fire. Wildfires in Australia that were consuming the news, consuming really global attention. I mean, they started in December or earlier
right.
in 2019. That's when they started getting media attention, but they carried on right through into the new year, and that's how the year started.
And you just mentioning that, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot about those wildfires. Yeah. They were quickly eclipsed because as January progressed, really, I'd say mid-January, attention shifted.
Yeah.
But there were other issues that happened before COVID kind of stole the show, and I mean that in a very negative way.
Right. We often forget about the Iran incident, the assassination of the general, General Soleimani, which drew so much international attention and provoked a great deal of fears of World War III. I think was at the time, and that's it was a huge moment for a long time before COVID started to take the show.
It was quite the incident, and of course, when we talk about Iran, I did cover a huge show on Iran where we spoke with Iranian dissidents here in Canada who are being targeted.
Right.
But Iran, something else happened that was quite important. Canadians died in Iran. Remember that incident with the airline being?
Well, after the death of General Soleimani, they of course the Iranian government said we will retaliate, and in a series of growing tensions, I think tragically a passenger airline was shot down, a Ukrainian Airlines passenger airline, and unfortunately in that incident, a number of Canadians were killed. And
correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the U.S. who did take out General Soleimani.
That's correct. There was a drone strike.
But I believe Canada paid the highest price with deaths in that airline.
There was a huge number of Canadians who died on that flight. Yeah.
And the black box to this day still has not been recovered.
There's online. I mean, the dispute over the black box was actually a long side story in that whole saga of different people trying to get. Even France was involved at some point trying to get the black box and to have it, I guess, downloaded and interpreted by an international body.
Because right now we're just kind of going on the words of Iran as to what they're.
Right, and I mean, Iran said that it was an accident. They did say they accept responsibility. They didn't mean to shoot it down, but at the end of the day, the airline went down, and there was a lot of Canadians who lost, family members on that flight, and families that will be impacted for the rest of their lives.
And when I interviewed the Iranian dissidents, they seem to be okay with Trudeau's response to the downing of the flight. That he did take some action.
I think you saw the Prime Minister take a few steps. I mean, I think. The horror of it, the shock of it was pretty. It was strongly felt across the country. I think we saw even fundraising efforts from just different members of the community in Canada who all stepped up to help. I guess put their loved ones and members of their community to rest.
Right. Well, pivoting to other geopolitical issues before we kind of get eclipsed by COVID, what other international issues stuck out for you this year?
And jumping off of the Iran thing built tensions across the Middle East and Iran, and as you know, the U.S. and Iran building a lot of tension as they were going along with each other. But you saw something unique in the Middle East, which was the Abraham Accords start to be signed. Started with Israel and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, then shortly followed by Bahrain, and then moving along, it seems to be most recently Morocco was added to the list, and Sudan is saying they'll normalize relations. So that's a huge development. Well, it's in the history of.
And explain to the viewers why this would be so significant.
Well, most of these countries had no diplomatic relations with Israel before, seeing Israel as a sort of pariah state. They were not wanting to engage with it in a meaningful way. So this was a huge shift. I mean, the last country countries where Egypt and Jordan, who signed deals years ago to normalize relations with Israel. And so you're seeing a big shift now in the geopolitical makeup of the region.
Right. Well, we're going to pick up this conversation right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're continuing our year in review here at Counterpoint today. And again, joining me in studio is Nathaniel Dueck, senior writer and analyst here at the News Forum. Nathaniel, we discussed Iran. We've talked about the wildfires in Australia, the Abraham Accords. Hong Kong was a huge issue. I've devoted several shows to the concerns of the Chinese Communist presence and in Hong Kong. And I think nothing was more significant than what we all kind of saw that was going to happen was the passing of the national security law on June 30th. Was this a surprise?
You know, from what I've been reading and from what I've been seeing, I think you're spot on in that passing the law was not a huge surprise. It was unusual because Hong Kong has never had a security law before. But that's not to say that they weren't going to get one. In fact, they were always supposed to have one, but the authorities always backed off from it because it was seen as really politically touchy in Hong Kong. So I think...
Well, and plus because they have the 50-year agreement with Britain, with the UK, when was the handing over of Hong Kong.
Yeah, one country, two systems.
Exactly,
right?
One country, two systems. So, and that was in 1997. So they weren't even halfway through.
No. So it was a big upset, and it caused a great deal of, let's put it politely and say, consternation in Hong Kong. There was a lot of people who were very upset. You saw massive street protests, protests for democracy.
Violence.
There was all kinds of things going on. I mean, you had students who occupied a university and were being besieged by police forces at one point. Like this was a very near and dear subject that a lot of Hong Kongers felt was directly attacking their identity and their freedoms and their basic understanding of the world.
Right, and if you've grown up, as many of these young students have, under a democratic system, to have that sort of removed from you and have the Chinese government come in and say, well, this is how it's going to be going forward, is a horror and a shock, and I completely understand why they're upset. And okay, most importantly, we have about 250,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong.
Yeah. Well, it's estimated around 300,000 Canadians live in Hong Kong. And that is a staggering number when you think if the situation got much more severe in Hong Kong, what would the repercussions be? And what is the Canadian government's responsibility to our citizens abroad? Which is a question we have not answered in any way.
We haven't, and
really.
I've held or dedicated at least 2 to 3 shows on this topic, and they're hoping to have some kind of expedited repatriation or expedited visa program. I haven't seen anything to that effect yet. Hopefully the new year will offer us something new and different. I don't know, but something has to happen because the situation in China is just devolving so rapidly. And then, of course, we cannot talk about China without talking about the 2 Michaels.
Right. Yeah, let's not forget that Canada has been very involved with the whole Chinese-U.S. tensions. Of course, widely seen as being arrested for the detainment of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, right? On the behest of the United States, she was arrested.
So that's 2 years.
Yeah, they've been over 2 years
detained for 2 years. But I did recently read some headlines suggesting that Trudeau is making some steps towards. They haven't been released, but he said things will be better. The things are maybe in the.
There seems to be some sort of motion happening. No one's really confirming anything, so it'll be a story to watch. But I mean, these Canadians have been away from home for a long time, and in many cases denied consular assistance.
We don't even know we don't even know what kind of treatment they're getting, and I'm assuming it's going to be bad treatment. I mean, we're dealing with a communist government here after all, and to speak to any of the 8 million Canadians who trace their roots to communist governments, and I'm sure they'll say they're probably being treated very poorly.
Well, and I mean, this year is also the awareness of the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang province in north, in western China. So it's that combined with the Michaels, you're starting to see, a China that's economically resurgent. It's becoming a powerhouse. It's taking its place on the world stage.
Okay, so why
human rights
what's
issues.
happening with the Uyghurs? Why is that so important to Canadians?
Well, I think that for a lot of Canadians, human rights are important and basic human values such as decency and freedom and being allowed to practice your religion, being allowed to practice your cultural heritage, being allowed to participate, to exist as you were born and as you feel you ought to be, right? And this is being denied by what look like what they're calling sometimes forced labor camps, effectively areas where you're forced to work.
So this is an interesting setup because we are going to get into the COVID discussion after this commercial break, but in the early part of January, there was a lot of information coming from China, or perhaps lack of information, and we didn't know if we could trust it because we were dealing with it due to COVID, but we didn't know we could trust it because it was coming from a communist Chinese government. And I think that sort of set up Canada's response, or some argue perhaps it was a delayed response. There's a trust issue here with the information that came out, but quickly, we don't even talk about China and COVID anymore, do we?
No.
Well, we're going to have that discussion right when we return from this commercial break. Stick around. Once again, joining me in studio is Nathaniel Dueck, senior writer and analyst on the News Forum. So COVID, the big elephant in the room. We are sitting 2 meters apart because of this disease, this virus. Is it an understatement to say that this was the worst thing that hit in 2020?
Oh, I'd say so. I would say so without a doubt. I mean, there's literally very little in the world that has not been in some way touched by this pandemic that has swept, from the novel coronavirus to what we have now, the full-blown COVID-19 pandemic, with actually a new variation that's just coming out and causing, lockdowns.
My anxiety is going already when you're speaking about there's a new variant, because then I'm like, we're going to do this all over again in 2021. Does this ever end? Is there light at the end of the tunnel? I sound so negative. It's the end of the year. What's wrong with me?
I know. Well, the good news is they say that the vaccine will be able to deal with the new strain. Shouldn't be a problem with that. And I would like to think that we've all learned something about how to handle the pandemic, and I certainly think that public health authorities and governments have become a bit more aware of what to do. I mean, you're seeing with this lockdown, you're already seeing governments across the country, across the world, including in Canada here, locking down borders, flights from the UK right off, which was not what happened at the beginning of the first pandemic.
So I want to talk about that. So yes, recently the government announced that they're going to stop flights from the UK due to the second variant. Where was the flight lockdown in January? We didn't have it. In fact, to this day, flights have been landing all the time. Early days when the US closed the border to flights from China, Canada didn't. No. We in fact have welcomed them up too. So now we're closing flights from the UK. I found that very strange.
Suspending flights, but yes.
Suspended.
Yeah. It's an interesting time, because I think what you're seeing is there's a difference between how things are being done and how they were done before. So maybe that's one of the things that we've learned. That the health minister said at the beginning, closing our borders can sometimes, be detrimental to the health response. Now you're seeing that it's being locked down. So that's a change in approach. So there's that.
Well, for me, the thing that sticks out most is, so we had the first lockdown in March, April, and we're very trusting people. We put our trust in the authorities, that they knew best, or they know best. And we abide by those rules, and we locked down, and we were in this together and taking one for the team, and we all did that. But quickly we've seen that trust eroded. And now when we hear about this province is locking down and we're going to keep the Walmarts open, but not the mom and pop shop, and when we've had small businesses on the show discussing their concerns, when we see an ununiform application of lockdowns, sometimes I have to ask myself, is the cure worse than the disease?
Well, I mean, I think you look at the number of people who died and the tragedy that's been brought on by this pandemic, and I think, I think in many cases governments are trying to do the best with the knowledge they have. Again, we went from knowing nothing about this coronavirus at the beginning of the year, and to now where we have an operational vaccine, actually several versions of it that have been approved. So, in some ways I like to think that this has actually been a testament to some of the resolve and the capacity of our government, our scientists, our medical system, and even our production to get this vaccine rolling. So on that front, I'd like to say, yeah, I mean, have there been missteps? Absolutely.
But I still see these missteps happening, though. Like on December 26th, nobody is going to be out anymore because there's going to be, for example, in Ontario, there's going to be a province-wide lockdown. Yeah. That's something that's shocking. We're going back to a lockdown.
Right.
Other provinces are already in a lockdown. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're late to the table, but Ontario is 1/3 of the population of Canada, so it's something that I am concerned about.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's nothing easy about these lockdowns for sure. I mean, I know lots of friends and family members who are small business owners and who are even people who work in small businesses as employees, and none of them have, escaped this unscathed. And I truly, like, it's been horrible, right? Now, that being said, can we manage to get out of this and to do something to build back better, as some
right.
people say? Yeah, I mean, and I'll go back to this. There has been a change in approach in that we see a lot of people around the world. They were shutting down airplanes as soon as they found about this virus, right? They said a week, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, right? A week, we're shutting down all our borders.
Right. New Zealand was
well, I mean, New Zealand is like they've isolated themselves 100%, yeah, right? So they've done it their way, but I still think that out of this pandemic, we have learned a few lessons. Now, that being said, the cost for a lot of people and their mental health, huge. Absolutely huge, and can't be understated. I also don't want to understate the achievements that have been made in both governance and science.
So hold that thought, because I want to get back to the economic cost of this pandemic, and we're going to be back from the commercial break in just a moment. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our year in review. Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining me in studio. We're discussing COVID, its impact in Canada. There's so many ways we could, finish this show, and I guess we'll have to finish it on COVID. Economically, I mean, there were many great programs or good programs that were rolled out by the federal government, and quickly, but there's a cost to all that. We have just hit $1 trillion on the debt clock. They don't even have enough. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation doesn't have enough room.
They broke the clock, right?
They broke the clock. That's exactly. How do we recover from this? That's a lot of money.
That's a ton of money.
We're not the United States.
No.
I'm not used to hearing $1 trillion thrown around.
That's an unusual number, and we can't just print it. And we're not a benchmark currency. People don't trade in Canadian dollars like they do the U.S. dollar. So undoubtedly, there's going to be some sort of economic effect down the road. But I mean, you just look at the mom and pop businesses that are struggling. Look at the amount of people who are going to be risking a lot of debt to manage to get through.
And of course, we want to be there for these mom and pop shops, but then you wonder, is this like a self-induced economic collapse that we're doing? Like, I'm still trying to figure out the way out of this. And then I think of the folks who received the CERB benefit or applied, but didn't see the net versus gross word, which was applied a month later, apparently, on the CERB application. Now, just before Christmas, they were getting letters saying you must pay this back.
Yeah.
These are people who are, if they made just under $5,000, they probably weren't doing so well to begin with.
Yeah.
Is this shocking? Am I the only one shocked?
No, I just
you're
think,
good at holding your cards.
I just think that there was so much that was unknown in that program rollout, and so part of me wants to give the government the benefit of the doubt in some ways.
It is unprecedented.
It's unprecedented, and that's basically what I'm trying to get at. It's unprecedented. They rolled out a program very quickly that really was helpful for a lot of Canadians. Now, that being said, if they do go back and like gather back the money, then there's going to be a bit of a problem with a lot of people whose that money's gone. It's spent. So it'll be difficult. But I mean, they're rolling out similar programs in the U.S.
But I guess we also have to keep in perspective. We say the government money. Well, that's our money. And we have to remember, are we like robbing Peter to pay Paul? Like, what exactly is happening here? But you're right, this is ultimately our money, and we've given confidence to our politicians to manage that as best as possible. Obviously at the beginning, yes, these programs worked. I'm questioning whether they still are effective, and if there's ever any end in sight to these programs.
I think the biggest thing is just a fiscal anchor of some kind needs to be established, whatever that might be. We need to have one in this country. I mean, it's costing us in terms of our some of our international credibility. So,
okay, but when the government wasn't sitting for all those months and these policies weren't debated, that's a problem.
well, I mean, you'll never get a complaint from me about getting Parliament back to sitting in the middle of a crisis. I think that is one of the most fundamental, crucial obligations of any government, is that when there is a national crisis, when there is some sort of event happening, leaders need to lead. They need to be seen to lead, and they need to be in their seat to lead.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to do this. I understand there needs to be safety precautions taken, but there are ways, as a developed country with, brilliant people all over, in the civil service, in the private sector, I'm sure we can find out ways to manage to make it happen.
Well, we'll have to see how we steer our way out of COVID. You talk about leaders leading. I saw governments around the world sitting, leading to some capacity. The U.S. election happened.
Oh yeah, how could we forget? It consumed the bandwidth, right?
To add more fuel to the fire, we're still navigating those waters, and the victor is still being debated.
Well, yeah, I mean,
or is it a done deal?
I would say that it's pretty much a done deal. I mean,
the Electoral College met.
Electoral College met. Votes are cast. The election was, let's not forget, very tight. It was very close. You can argue about the majority vote, but in this country, as we know, the popular vote doesn't count for much, and that's a fact. The point is, the Electoral College was selected, and it selected its victor, and that's been the way it is, and that election is done.
So all this talk about vote rigging and Dominion voting machines, which are based out of Toronto.
I mean, come on. I mean, it's done. The election is done. Donald Trump lost the election. The next president, President-elect Biden, will become the next president of the United States, and that
inauguration will happen in just a few weeks.
Yes, very shortly.
Excellent.
So it'll be interesting.
Well, we'll have to see what the year holds for us. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope it's a better year.
Yeah, thanks for us all.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, that was 2020. I'm sure hoping that 2021 has a more positive outlook. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.